apparently all of these yogis, these spiritual meditating people, mostly located in the Himalayas and India, seem to possess superhuman abilities. Here's an example. You might remember Rebazar Tarsh from a previous episode. He stood at about 6 feet, weighed 185 pounds. He was a thin, fit man. He had dark skin, dark eyes, jet black hair and beard. And to look at him, you would think he was about 35 years old. He claimed to be 500 years old. Now, before you dismiss that completely, you're going to want to listen to today's episode. I was reading up on a guy named Paul Twitchell. I mentioned him in the Helene Hadsel episode, and he had some very interesting abilities. He called himself a spiritual Ek master. He considered himself to be the only one. Ek is short for a Kankar, which is the science of soul travel. So he claimed to be able to just leave his body at will. And he could teach this to other people. And even to this day, you can find people who are followers of a Kankar. I've got it linked in the show notes, a whole group of people. I thought about joining myself, but I think soul travel sounds very interesting. And statistically speaking, I believe that 1 in 5 of you have done it, have been able to at least leave your body, have had an out-of-body experience outside of psychedelic drug use. I never have. No matter how many drugs I take, I have never been able to leave my body, but it sounds very interesting. While I was researching for it, I read something that struck me as being so interesting. I've just fallen down a complete rabbit hole ever since I read it. And that is what today's topic is going to be about. And it is this fact that apparently all of these yogis, these spiritual meditating people, mostly located in the Himalayas, seem to possess superhuman abilities. So I do want to start off by talking about, I think probably we've all heard of Shangri-La or Shambhala. It's this mystical place in the mountains. It's basically like heaven, but the stories make it sound as though this actually was a physical place that you could get to. And there are ancient texts that have been written with directions to Shambhala in them, but the directions are very vaguely written, and it's said that you have to attain a very high degree of spiritual understanding in order to be able to interpret these directions clearly. You're not going to be able to load them into MapQuest, is all I'm saying. But even Paramahansa Yogananda, in his book Autobiography of a Yogi, which came out I think in the 1950s, he spoke of his guru's guru who had been there. He claimed had physically actually been there. Babaji, I think, was what he was called. He, by the way, was claimed to be about over 1,000 years old. So there we go again with attaining these extremely old ages. There's also a man named Gopinath Kaviraj. And by the way, during this episode, there's going to be some words and names that are totally mispronounced, okay? So we're all just gonna have to deal, all right? Even after listening to them, I still can't get it. But Gopinath Kaviraj wrote a whole book about this mythical place, Shangri-La. And he claimed that gurus would go there, and they would literally go there and acquire certain cities. That's spelled Siddhi, which is a sort of a special ability, a gift. And one person was able to go there and learn something called solar science, which is the science of being able to convert something into something completely different, harnessing the power of the sun. And my guess is that, based on my limited spiritual understanding, is that really this type of ability would only be conferred to someone who is going to use it properly. Because frankly, if all of us could do this, the world would be in total, utter chaos almost immediately. That's just a fact. I think we all intuitively know that's true. So Shangri-La, I've never been there, but I'd like to go, maybe someday. But the next topic I want to bring up is this idea of sort of dying before you die. And this tends to be a theme in what Eckhart Tolle, I know Eckhart Tolle talks about it, the importance of sort of dying, meaning that you really let go of all your attachment to everything that your ego is interested in, is attached to. And it is really only this way that you can attain ultimate freedom. And recently it's been very clear that some monks will literally sort of almost consciously die. This has happened multiple times. And what ends up happening, interestingly, that our conventional science can't seem to explain, is that their bodies don't seem to decompose. Not the way ours would. Like a normal body is going to start to look pretty awful literally within 24 to 48 hours. But they will return to the bodies of these pre-deceased, semi-deceased monks, and their bodies will be totally the same 20 days later. So you can barely even tell, which is astounding. And Western science is totally baffled by this. But Tibetan Buddhists know exactly what's going on. They're like, yeah, this is Thukdam, or Thukdam. Again, pronouncing. I'm not going to. Thuk means mind, Thuk means mind, and Dam means samadhi, or the meditative state. So it's this deep meditative state that they go into. And for all intents and purposes, they're dead, but I think some part of them is still sort of powering the body. And the way a Tibetan Buddhist, I think, would explain it is that the soul is sort of slowly unspooling from the body. So it's still kind of in there. And how long, I have no idea. But some of these bodies have been found without decay several years later. So recently there's been a monk who has seemed to achieve the state of being mostly dead. And his name is Geshe Lobsang Daringal. He was born in 1934, and he joined a monastery at the age of 20, and he studied Tibetan Buddhism. But then about 5 years later, he actually had to escape because the Chinese came in and occupied Tibet. But ultimately, he would eventually find his way to southern India, where he, I believe, lived the rest of his life, I'm guessing, meditating all the time. And he ended up mostly dying in November of 2022, so just a few months ago. And even until December, people were looking at his body, wondering how he had not decayed. And Western science can't figure it out. There's even an article in Big Think about this. I've got it linked in the show notes. And actually, the Dalai Lama has called for Western science to study this phenomenon, to try to understand it. And really, in his mind, there's no contradiction between spirituality and science. The things that go on, these seemingly paranormal things that go on, can all be explained. They just aren't yet. And so we think that it's woo, but it's just something that science hasn't figured out yet. So I do want to talk about this monk who was found frozen in Mongolia in 2015. So when he was found, he was sitting in a lotus position and perfectly mummified. Now, this isn't just because he was frozen. That also would preserve a body, but even above and beyond that, it's seemingly supernatural, the situation that his body was found in. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a picture in the show notes of him. He could use some Botox, but for the most part, it is impressive how well preserved his body is. But they think they know who he is. They're not sure. And that's one of the interesting details. So they think it was a monk, a famous monk. His name was Dashi Dorzo Itigilov. He was born in 1852, and he mostly died in 1927. And how did he die? So he was literally talking to an entire crowd just before he died. And I think he basically announced, yeah, I'm going to die now. But then he tells them, come and see my body in 30 years. And he goes and he sits down and gets into a lotus position, and then he just dies, just almost on purpose. My neighbor called it suicide. I don't think it's exactly like that. It was some sort of weird conscious death. And so the people that were standing there, they were like, oh, I guess they just walked away. That would be a really weird thing to watch. And then just, all right, peace. But they came back 30 years later. They dug him out of a crypt, and lo and behold, his body looks very well preserved, and nobody knows how that happened. So my question is he still kind of in there? If the consciousness is still unspooling, does that mean there's still part of him there? So if you chopped off his head, like, would that literally kill him? I don't know. So they were all impressed and amazed, and then they shoved him back into the crypt. And I don't know, they went to go eat a pizza, I'm not sure. But 75 years later, they wanted to get another look at it. And once again, it was remarkably well preserved. But I guess they put it back into the crypt. And then a few years later, some thief was caught trying to smuggle a mummified Tibetan monk. What for? One wonders. Like, what would you want a mummified Tibetan monk for? So that's something I definitely hope comes up in a future podcast, because I can only imagine that they might be up to something nefarious. But he was caught smuggling it. But anyway, I'm guessing that they took the monk, and then maybe they just threw it out. I don't know what they did with the monk body. But then in 2015, they find a monk, and they're and the guess is that it is this guy, Tilagov. Now, I don't know what the details are from when the thief got caught with him and then how he ended up being found somewhere else. That is unclear, but they do think this was him. Anyway, there is a picture of him in the show notes. So apparently an aide to the Dalai Lama said that if a monk can remain in a meditative state, then he can become a Buddha. And he says, quote, reaching such a high spiritual level, the meditator will also help others, and all the people around will feel a deep sense of joy. And Eckhart Tolle actually kind of talks about this as well when he says that some of these great spiritual leaders die. People will go and just walk around their sarcophagus just to be in their presence. And that alone is a powerful experience. Okay, so that's the weird topic of thuckdam. I feel like that's a really weird word to say out loud. Thuckdam. Thuckdam, maybe? Of thuckdam. It sounds terrible. I need to stop saying that. But that's that. And when I talk about Paramahansa Yogananda, he also attained the state in the most dramatic way possible, but that's going to be a future episode. What other supernatural abilities do yogis have? Is it possible they can go for a while without food and water? Well, I wouldn't be bringing it up if it wasn't possible. And we all know that people can fast, and even normal human beings can fast for quite a while. One time I did a 5-day fast, and that was the most horrible experience of my life. I don't know if I'll ever do it again. And some of you might remember, just a couple of years ago, there was a story of this man, and he must have weighed something like 300 pounds. He was very overweight. And he came into the hospital, and he was like, I think I'm going to do some fasting. Will you guys monitor me and make sure everything's okay with that? And they were like, cool, sure, we'll do that. And so he went a day without food, and then another day, and then another day. And this man he refused to eat until he was thin again. He went for 380 days without food. And this is documented. Like, literally, I've got a link in the show notes, but the story is from diabetes.co.uk. So this is an official story. And they even have a before and after picture of him. But his name was Angus Barbieri. And the whole time he wasn't eating, they were sort of monitoring his electrolyte levels. And so just to make sure that all that was fine, he took some vitamins. He drank black tea, black coffee, and sparkling water. And that was it. And he did that for over a year until he was thin. And he literally only went to the bathroom once every 40 to 50 days. Number 2. Number 1, I'm sure he was going every day. But number 2, that was it for him. And it worked. And then even 5 years after he'd stopped the fast, He had only gained back about 15 pounds, which isn't bad. Like, to gain about 3 pounds a year is not so bad, especially when you consider how big he'd been to begin with. But what if you're not morbidly obese to begin with? What if you're a thin, svelte person? How long can you go really without food before your body just starves and dies? One Indian yogi claims that he hasn't eaten any food in 70 years. And before you call bull on this, he literally allowed scientists to study him. So he went to a hospital, and there's a whole documentary on it. I've got it linked in the show notes. He went to a hospital and they monitored him for 10 days. And they were kind of hawkish about it because some of the scientists that were monitoring him were convinced he was a total sham artist. By the way, to look at this man, you just never guess that he's trying to be a scammer. He just doesn't look like the kind of person who's trying to do something flamboyantly to get attention. And literally, the man himself, he spends all of his time in solitude, but then once a year he comes down for this particular festival. It might be twice a year, and so that people can pay their respects to him. Yeah, so they monitored him for 10, I can't say monitored. They monitored him for 10 days, and they had CCTV videoing him the entire time. They had multiple people who were watching him, all of them making sure that he did not receive any food and no water. And he's just sitting there meditating, completely calm the entire time. And they even, I don't know why, but they even monitored his bladder. So they were able to tell that this is insane, but they could see that the bladder was filling up and then it was just emptying, but resorbing. It wasn't going out the normal way. It was just resorbing. So he's using those fluids again and again. How did all of this happen? He said that when he was 7 years old, he was participating in this several day long festival in India. And on day 8, he saw a vision, and 3 goddesses came to him. The goddesses Kali, Lakshmi, and Saraswati. They came to him and they told him, "Come, follow us." I guess they were telling him to follow them into the Himalayas. So of course he's excited to go, but he said, what am I going to do about food? Like, I don't have any of that. And all 3 of the goddesses put a finger on his mouth and they said, "You will never need to eat or drink ever again." And from that day on, it was true. He never did need to eat or drink again. And you can check out that show, that documentary in the show notes. I feel like if a goddess came to me and said, "You'll never need to eat or drink ever again," I would be like, "Can we negotiate that?" So here's just a story about a soldier who was fighting in World War II. His name was Captain Farrell, and he was very interested in Indian religion and Indian philosophy. And so he was invited by a local king to visit this place in India at the foothills of the Himalayas. And they all set up camp in this one place, and they went to sleep. And that night, he felt somebody come into his tent and come over to him and say, "Hey, you need to move away from here. There's somebody that I'm expecting, and they're going to be right in this spot. So I need all of you to pick up camp and go somewhere else." And he turned on the light and he looked around and nobody was there. And so then he went out of his tent and once again he looked around, couldn't see anything. And he's kind of freaked out because it sort of felt like it was a ghost that just talked to him. So he goes back into his bed and closes his eyes as if to fall asleep, but there's not going to be any sleep that night. And so he's sitting there with his eyes very tightly shut. And once again, he feels someone come into the room. He can tell they've come into the room. And this time he sees the shadow of a figure at the foot of his bed. And this figure, once again, basically tells him the same thing. hey, dude, you gotta move because I'm expecting somebody here. Now, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, that's cool. You can come meet me in that north hill that you see over yonder. And so even though the message is pretty clear, he decides to go see this person that's talking to him. Because once again, he turns on the light, no one there. As soon as he turns on the light, the shadow's gone. So he's properly freaked out, and there's no going back to sleep at that point. So he gets up and he just heads towards that hill. And it was a 3.5 hour hike uphill. And in the Himalayas, I'm sure it wasn't not treacherous. But he said that he could tell he was just guided the entire way. It was almost like a hand was guiding him the entire way, giving him the strength to keep going and also helping him in the right direction. And finally he makes it to the spot and he just sort of sits down and he's pretty exhausted. And that's when he looks up and he sees this saint. And he's scrawny. He's a scrawny little dude, but he looks powerful and he's got like this light that's emanating somehow from his forehead. And the saint tells him, Mr. Farrell, take off your shoes and you can climb down to meet me over there. And Captain Farrell is so freaked out. He's like, how did you know my name? How did I hear your voice way over there, 3.5 hours away? Like he doesn't, all of these questions just are popping into his head. Like, what is going on right now? He's freaking out. And the saint says to him, almost as if he could read his mind, he says, maybe he can, whatever you have seen or heard cannot be understood by the ordinary human mind. For that, you have to become a disciplined student, give up worldly pleasures, all that stuff, to be able to understand what he just saw. So he climbs down the rock and he sits with the saint in this little tiny area that's really only big enough for the saint. So he knows this guy's just living there by himself. And he said that he's sitting there and he's so exhausted. I mean, that had to have been the toughest struggle getting up there. But the saint gives him a pat on the back and he said immediately it was like his whole body just felt completely rejuvenated and re-energized. And that's a common theme. You read that frequently in these stories of these interactions with these yogis. So that's when the saint tells him, so here's the deal. There's a student of mine, and he was a student of mine in one of his previous lives, but he doesn't remember that previous life. But he's making his way over to the Himalayas to me, and he's going to stop in that particular spot where you guys are camped. And if there's somebody already camped there, it might derail him. And I really want to get him back into my fold so he can be my student once more. Captain Farrell is like, okay, none of that makes sense, but I'll do what you say. And so he goes back to camp. He tells them what's going on, and they all pick up. It's so cute that they just accept it. You know, they just accept the fact that this is totally supernatural. But we're all going to move camp so that this guy can meet back with his old student who's now in a completely new body because he's reincarnated. So they do that, and lo and behold, they see the student come into that camp area, and he's going to stay there. And so Captain Farrell has to see what's going on. So he goes and he meets the student, and so also does the yogi show up to meet his old student. And of course, the guy still doesn't remember anything. This is a previous life. And so they all sit down, they light a fire, and the guru says some chants. He gets into a state. They're all kind of in a meditative state. And Captain Farrell said that literally R2-D2 style, the saint has a light beam out of his eye onto a tree in front of him. And you could see on the tree the whole history of this student's previous life. He just shows him his previous life. And as this is going, as all these scenes from his previous life are going, the student is sitting there and remembering all of it. He's like, I did that. I remember this. So his memory is back to him. He remembers who he was, and he and his teacher go off to, I guess, meditate some more because they hadn't done enough of that. But all of this really changed Captain Farrell's life. So he himself ended up also becoming a student of the Indian yogis. So when he died, he went straight to hell. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Totally kidding. So some of you may also have heard of not a Tibetan monk, but a Dutchman named Wim Hof. And he's well known for just being able to withstand extraordinarily cold temperatures. And you can see him, there's literally a test where he just got into a vat of ice water and just hung out there for an hour. No problem. And he's climbed frozen mountains, and he's basically always in a pair of shorts. Like, he doesn't need to bundle up. And he teaches people how to do this. He's very passionate about it. It's actually his main focus right now is to teach people how to withstand these really cold temperatures. And he thinks that you can really attain other sort of abilities and capabilities by being able to do this. So, for example, he got a group of his students to undergo testing, and they literally took a group of his students and a group of just control students who weren't doing the Wim Hof method, and they injected them all with something called endotoxin, which is basically the part of the bacteria that makes you feel sick. So they injected everybody with that, and they showed very clearly that everybody who was a Wim Hof student who regularly did his practices, which I'll talk about in a second, were able to recover remarkably faster from this endotoxin than the controls. So he's been able to demonstrate some pretty amazing stuff. But what does he do? And so when you get there to his retreat in, I want to say, the Netherlands, when you get there, he has people do these breathing exercises where you're literally hyperventilating for over a minute and even maybe longer. And then you do these breath holds. You try to hold your breath as long as possible. And you just do a lot of breathing exercises like that. And he's got some online stuff available as well if you want to try that. Because, I mean, anybody can do it. I've tried it, and I'll be honest, I just give up. But it is interesting. Like, sometimes some of these breath exercises can make you feel very elated, very much at peace in a really high elated state. But from there, he's able to take his students and just dump them into a frozen lake. And I don't know what the process is from breathing exercises to frozen lake. I don't know what that is, but somehow it helps with that. And I mean, within a week, he can take you and make you one of these people who can withstand these amazingly cold temperatures. So it's pretty remarkable. So there's proof already that happens. And I wonder if Wim Hof, even, if he didn't exist, would people believe in some of these yogis? Because there have been stories from time immemorial, once again, of people witnessing yogis withstanding extraordinarily cold temperatures and just being able to dip into frozen lakes with nothing and hang out there for a while. But to me, that's the easiest one to believe, but it's still completely supernatural. But the only reason it's easy to believe is because Wim Hof has just demonstrated it. You cannot deny what he's done. He's done it for cameras. He's done it for everyone. But some of the supernatural powers that I read about seem to also be expounded upon in this book that kept coming up called Autobiography of a Yogi, which, by the way, I can't think of a more boring name for a book. That was before I knew what yogis did, like how supernatural they are. And this book is packed full of pretty rad stories. And that is going to be my next episode. So if you enjoy hearing about superhuman monks, then be sure to tune in. That is it for this episode. Thank you for tuning in, and I will catch you next time.